Blessings in Jesus, dear friends. My name is James Jacob Prash from Moriel Ministries. Thank you so much for joining us here on Moriel TV and on RTN. For some time, I've been warning that a lot of Christians are putting their hope in political figures of a politically conservative or right-wing persuasion in the United States and even in Britain, certainly with the rise of the Reform Party, with people who I generally agree with politically, Geert Wilders in Holland and others, who are beginning to stand up against globalism and against the trends left, against the pandering to the growth of radical Islam, and even to select oligarchical and corporate interests that are using government as their private vehicles, as the super wealthy have always done. Again, my own political persuasion would not be left wing at all. I was a socialist in my youth, but I am no longer that. I came to realize socialism did not work. However, I do realize the abuses of robber baron capitalism. Man is fallen, and our salvation is not in any political economic system or any political candidate or political party. Our salvation is in Jesus and his return when the government shall be upon his shoulder, as Isaiah wrote. I pray for whoever gets elected. There have been people I prayed that God would remove and prevent from winning elections. And I have a lot of sympathy to Donald Trump's policies, generally speaking, howbeit not all of them. In any event, a lot of Christians have been very naive going down this political line and have been looking at certain things. Just because someone is politically to the right does not mean that they are always in accord with the purposes or values of God. I can think of a number of figures that were identified as being politically conservative, major figures, leading figures whom I once had a high regard for, who have gone off into some terrible things. I think of Tucker Carlson, the journalist. I think of Candace Owen. I had such a high view of that woman one time. I hoped she could have been the American Margaret Thatcher, the first woman president who would have upheld traditional family American Judeo-Christian values. I had a high view of that woman, very high. To a degree, Marjorie Taylor Greene in Congress. Well, all of them have gone off. All of them have gone off. And among other things, they've all turned against Israel and the Jews to the point of ridiculous conspiracy theorists subscribing to conspiracy theories and becoming conspiracy theorists, saying things that are simply distortions of fact, churning out the same kind of anti-Judeo-Jewish rhetoric or anti-Zionist rhetoric that the political left does, saying the same thing. Now remember, Hitler and Stalin were both socialists. They appeared to be at both ends of the ideological spectrum, but in the end they were six of one, half dozen of the other. As I always say, the three biggest killers of the 20th century, perhaps the three biggest mega murderers in human history thus far, Mao Zedong, Joseph Stalin, and Adolf Hitler, were all socialists. The Nazis were the National Socialist Workers' Party of Deutschland, of Germany. They were all Darwinists. All of them were Darwinists. No matter what ideological differences seemed to separate them on paper, they behaved the same way. When Candace Owen she married an English gentleman. She converted to Roman Catholicism. And she's become an activist on behalf of Roman Catholicism, despite the scandals and pedophilia that beset the Vatican and the Roman Church, including this present Pope, who protected pedophiles in Chicago and in Peru. She's departed. She played a right-wing card, but then she showed her true colors. The Antichrist is going to do this. He's going to deceive Christians up to a point, and he's going to deceive Israel and the Jews beyond that. This is something that Jesus made a punctuated reference to prophetically In the Gospel of St. John, chapter 5, Jesus said the following. He said, I come in my Father's name, in verse 43, and you don't receive me. If another comes in his own name, you will receive him. Now, of course, this had a prophetic meaning for Simon Bar Kokhba in the 2nd century, but Bar Kokhba was the first major antichrist. There are many antichrists, but after the Jews rejected the true Messiah, they began following one antichrist after another. The first major one was Bar Kokhba, who Rabbi Akiva said was the antichrist. The most recent one, major one, is Rabbi Menachem Schneerson, the leader of the Chabad, the Lubavitch movement, who died in Brooklyn. They believe he's going to raise from the dead. The Lubavitch movement, the Lubavitch Hasidim, who are Kabbalists, they're mystical, they practice Jewish mysticism. Antichrist. Antichrist is going to be able to deceive up to a point. We always point out the only two people called the son of perdition are Judas Iscariot and the Antichrist. They're both called the son of perdition. Whenever you see something about Judas, the Holy Spirit is trying to tell us something about the Antichrist to come. Remember, when we read it synoptically, Judas said, why was this precious ointment not sold and given to the poor? Well, he was stealing the money. He didn't care about the poor. He just used the plight of the poor to masquerade what he really was, convincing people he was a great humanitarian. One of the ways, howbeit not the main way, but one of the ways the Antichrist to come is going to bamboozle people, con people, even deceive Christians up to a point, is he's going to seem like a wonderful humanitarian who cares about the rights of the poor and third world poverty or whatever, things of this nature. He's going to misrepresent himself as a champion of the poor. And people are going to buy into it and subscribe to it. That is how he's going to ingratiate himself. Now, again, there are many antichrists. There are these two ultimate beasts from the book of Revelation, and there's the spirit of Antichrist. The spirit of Antichrist has always been around. I think of Mother Teresa of Calcutta. According to the Roman Catholic Church in India, she actually underwent an exorcism. Whether it's true or not, that is what was reported. And she made it very clear when she got the Nobel Prize that she did not convert or try to convert or get the people of India to leave Hinduism or Islam. She said her mission in taking care of the poor and giving them a place to die with dignity, a clean environment to die with dignity, was to make them better Hindus or better Muslims. Go to hell, go directly to hell. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. That was her gospel. Moses and Paul both said other gods are demons, but Hinduism is polytheistic. They worship a plethora of demonic entities. That was okay with Mother Teresa. Islam worships the Nabatean moon god Allah. Islam has perpetrated some horrific terrorist attacks in India. Horrific. At the gate of India, they've bombed hotels, they've bombed hospitals. They've bombed trains with Hindu tourists and pilgrims. There's tremendous hatred in the Punjab between the Sikhs and the Muslims in Pakistan, and between the Hindus and Pakistan, and it's over Islamic Jihad. Well, this didn't bother Mother Teresa. But I know many people who are born-again Christians who hold her up as some kind of a model of what Christianity should be. If you can't see through Mother Teresa, who openly said that, you could, it's on the internet, but she said it on PBS when she got the Nobel Prize. I watched it in America on PBS. She actually said this. She doesn't give these people the gospel or want to make them Christians or followers of Jesus. She wants to make them better Hindus or better Muslims. Well, Antichrist will be like that, only much, much better at it than Mother Teresa or any other deceiver. Much better at it. He's going to use humanitarian concern, make himself seem like a real crusader on behalf of the poor to ingratiate himself to people. People will see that, and if you speak against him, how dare you speak against such a godly man, a wonderful humanitarian? And I mean, there's going to be Christians who are going to say that. Remember the son of perdition, Judas. Lord, is it I? Lord, is it I? Not until Jesus revealed who he was did the other apostles know. The people who were with him, who'd been with him for 3.5 years, worked with him, ministered with him, did not know who he was until Jesus revealed him. The Antichrist will be the same. As we've been warning for many years, for decades, if people professing to be born-again Christians cannot see through obvious false prophets, false teachers, deceivers, if you can't see through a Kenneth Copeland or a Joyce Meyer or a Benny Hinn, if you can't see through a Michael Brown or a Mike Bickle or a Brian Houston or a Bill Hybels or a Robert Schuller, if you cannot see through obvious deceivers, obvious false prophets, obvious false teachers, if you can't see through a Benny Hinn or a Copeland, what is going to happen when this guy comes? If you don't know what's wrong with the New Apostolic Reformation or the ecumenical movement, they're never going to have a clue when this guy comes. He's going to be very, very good. He will bamboozle Christians. He will bamboozle Israel and the Jews. He'll have no problem bamboozling nominal Christianity. They're already bamboozled. People in the World Council of Churches, liberal Protestantism, Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, those people are already conned by the devil. I mean, if possible, the elect will be deceived. Jesus again warned about deception aimed at the elect 4 times more than he warned about anything else in the Olivet Discourse. He warned of wars increasing 1 time, rumors of wars 1 time, famines, pestilence, seismological activity, increases in earthquakes. 1 time, 1 time, 1 time, 1 time. Deception aimed at Christians, 4 times. Why would Jesus warn repeatedly? 4 times more than he warned about anything else if it couldn't happen. Well, Paul warns about it as well in 1 Timothy 4 and elsewhere. A deception is coming. A deception is already here. The mystery of iniquity is already at work, we are told in the New Testament. The spirit of Antichrist has already been active, and there are many Antichrists. But ultimately, we will have these 2 beasts from Revelation. The one from the earth, which is associated somehow with Israel, and one from the sea, with the Gentile nations, with a particular contextual emphasis on the nations around the Mediterranean from the time it was written in the 1st century, at the end of the 1st century. I hold that John, as reported by Irenaeus, who got his doctrine from John via Polycarp, is the author who returned to Ephesus from Patmos after the exile of Domitian and wrote the book of Revelation at the end of the 1st century. The Lord kept him alive supernaturally to an extremely old age. And John was warning in his epistle, Antichrist is coming. The Antichrist is coming. But there are many of them, said John. There are many. And he's going to be very, very good at deceiving. I see Christians being deceived in the political realm. I see Christians being deceived in the theological realm. They're taken in by word, faith, money preachers, by ecumenical con artists, I remember the late Chuck Colson. He was sent to prison for political corruption when he was a liar and a deceiver for Richard Nixon during the Watergate era. He became a believer, he professed. I'm not judging if he did or didn't, while in prison. And he founded a prison ministry. His wife was a Roman Catholic, however, but he drafted and promoted evangelicals and Catholics together. Don't witness to Roman Catholics. Don't share the gospel with Roman Catholics. They're already saved. Now, again, the New Testament tells us in Galatians, if an angel of God comes with another gospel, they're accursed. Does the blood of Christ cleanse from all sin? Or do you atone in purgatory for your own? Are we justified by faith through grace? Is it the second birth? Or is it sacraments? The Roman Catholic Church has a different gospel. His blood cleanses from all sin. This didn't matter to Colson. Colson had been a corrupt liar for a corrupt politician. Then he became a corrupt liar for a corrupt religious leader, the Pope. That's what he did. There was political deception and religious deception. That is what we see now. There is political deception aimed at Christians, and there is religious deception. Now, obviously, I preferred Mr. Trump to Biden or Harris or people like that. I pray for Mr. Trump every day. He has stood by Israel more than any other president, and more importantly, he stood by the persecuted church and the rights of Christians more than any other president in modern times. I respect a lot of what he did. He is being badly advised. He's surrounded by some people who are false brethren, Paula White, an immoral woman. He's surrounded by Christians who advise him badly, but there are other Christians who are mainstream born-again believers, like Governor Huckabee, possibly Secretary of War Peter Hegseth. I'm not attacking Mr. Trump personally. I urge people to pray for him, and I prefer him to any of the other candidates that were around. He's done a lot of good. However, salvation is not in him. I've been warning and warning and warning. The book of Daniel makes it clear. The Antichrist will broker a false peace in the Middle East. A false peace. There is no way there will be a lasting peace in the Middle East until Jesus establishes his millennial kingdom. There'll be a false peace and a betrayal. Israel will make a covenant with death. But the idea of the Abraham Accords, Jew, Christian, and Muslim come together. Islam is fundamentally incompatible with Western Judeo-Christian values. Fundamentally incompatible. Even in the Old Testament, kings had to be a descendant of David, and high priests had to be a descendant of Aaron. They had the Deuteronomic legislation. That was their constitution and their body of law, but there was still this separation between government and the Levitical sacrificial system. They were separate. Jesus said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God. The kings of Israel were to be guided by God's principles and God's law. They were to be shepherds, according to Ezekiel 34, and the character of David, who typified Christ as the good shepherd. That is true. And in the New Testament, we are told the ministers of government are to be the Lord's ministers. We are to pray for them, that they will rule in the fear of God, that we can live quiet, unpersecuted lives when possible. Throughout most of history, however, most Christians have been persecuted, and persecution is increasing. Even in Great Britain and Canada, Sweden, and to a degree in the United States, we see the rudiments of persecution of Bible-believing Christians. Meanwhile, however, let's look at this. While you have this kind of separation between religion, as it were, I use that term sparingly, for want of a better term, and government, a relationship, but a separation. That was in Judaism. That is in Christianity. It's not in Islam. Sharia, the religious law, is the civil law, the caliphate. Islam is fundamentally incompatible with Judeo-Christian values. Things that we would see in the Western world as corruption, political corruption. In Islamic countries, to some degree, all 52 of them, nepotism, that's just the way governments operate. We would decry pedophilia. Islam, no. Muhammad married Aisha when she was 6, took her virginity when she was 9, said Abu Bakr. It's in the Hadith. Pedophilia is not a problem. Democracy? No. It's not democracy. It's a caliphate. It is like Iran. It is a theocratic dictatorship. There is no way Islam can ever be compatible with the Judeo-Christian West. As we've said, democracy is disappearing from the West because the West has abandoned the faith in the God of the Bible, the God of Israel, and has turned away from the biblical principles upon which both British parliamentary democracy and American constitutional democracy were predicated. Even the founding fathers of America, who were not Christians in the biblical sense, such as Thomas Jefferson, who was a deist, or Thomas Paine, or Benjamin Franklin, who was essentially an agnostic, they still believed in the importance of biblical principles morally and socially. Others of the founding fathers did believe the scriptures. You have no such thing. In the Islamic world, it just cannot coexist. There are 3 times as many conflicts in the world today involving Islam as there are all the other religio people groups put together. And I've said before, between 560 and 580,000 Arab Muslims were killed by the Assad regime in Syria. You didn't see the world protesting and people on college campuses having conniptions. Between 4 and 500,000 people in Yemen were killed in the conflict with the Houthis. You didn't see riots on campuses and protests in the streets of London or at Columbia University. You didn't see this. You never saw it. Now that there's a temporary ceasefire in Gaza, Hamas is killing its own people, taking them out in front of firing squads and shooting them in the streets. They're killing each other again. They use their own civilians and their own children as human shields when they attack the Israelis. So when the Israelis were forced to fire back in self-defense, there'd be civilian casualties. Killing their own people. When the Israelis left Gaza in 2005 and they had the chance to make a so-called Palestinian state, instead there was a war between Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas. They killed 25,000 of each other. Did the world protest? No. They can murder all of each other they want. King Hussein of Jordan in Black September 1970 kills 15,000, between 15 and 18,000 of Arafat's followers, known as Ashaf, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, is what it became, in 12 days. The British trained Jordanian Legion, its military officers educated at Sandhurst, the West Point of Great Britain. Did anybody say anything? No. This ceasefire in Gaza, brokered by President Trump, is no sooner over when Hamas is shooting its own people in the street. This is the nature of it. There's no way it can't even live with itself. One of the reasons they have to kill Jews and persecute Christians is because if they don't have an infidel, as they call us, to murder, they will murder each other. That's the only basis of peace among them. 20 years ago, 3.3 million Christians were systematically exterminated. 3.3 million in the Sudan. It's happening again. In the last 18 months, approximately 140 to 160,000 Christians have been murdered by Islamic militias in Sudan once again. Murder all the black African Christians you want. Do you see protests on the campuses of America or demonstrations in the streets of London at Trafalgar Square? No, you don't see this. It's all hypocrisy. It's only when Israel defends itself. Hypocritical governments. Carney in Canada. Abbo in Australia. Certainly Martin and Higgins in Republic of Ireland. Starmer in England. Macron in France. And that horrible, horrible figure, Sanchez in Spain. Condemning Israel as war criminals for defending itself from the same radical Islam that perpetrated tumultuous terrorist attacks in Madrid, in London, in the banlieue in Paris, in New York. Yet they become the victims. Israel becomes the oppressor for defending itself. And the lie is told and told and told again. It is a colonial presence. Not according to the United Nations, who established it, but now they're saying something directly contrary to their own partition. They recognized the Jews as the indigenous people, as did the League of Nations, as did the British government, as did the pre-Ba'athist government of Iraq with King Faisal, as did the pre-Wahhabist government of Saudi Arabia with Musharraf. It was Sharif. Even Muslims said it was the Jews' native land. The great-grandfather of King Abdullah of Jordan, for whom he is named, King Abdullah I, was murdered by the Mufti's men, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who had a concordant with Hitler. He murdered King Abdullah I because King Abdullah I wanted to make peace with the Jews, so they murdered him. That's why the Muslim Brotherhood murdered Anwar Sadat. That is why Hezbollah murdered Bashar Jamiel in Lebanon. Any Arab wanting to make peace with Israel would be murdered. Yet Israel's the culprit. Well, Mr. Trump moves the American embassy to Jerusalem, which one American administration after another failed to do, even though Congress appropriated the money for it to happen. And they agreed to do it, but none of them did till Mr. Trump came. He's seen something as a Cyrus the Great type figure in Israel, even among the religious. They look upon him as a heroic figure. I watched the news clip with Rabbi Yehuda Glick, who I know. He's a nice guy. I consider him something of a friend. And he was in the Knesset clapping for Mr. Trump as a hero. Okay, we got the hostages released. Mr. Trump is seen as a righteous Gentile by religious Jews and by secular Israelis as well. And deservedly so. I'm not saying otherwise. But what I am saying is the Abraham Accords. There can be no peace between Islam and the West. There are non-fundamentalist Muslims. There are Ahmadi Muslims that you can coexist with. There are Bedouins you can coexist with. But fundamentalist Sunni Islam, and certainly Shia Islam, you cannot coexist in the long term. When they make a peace with Israel or with Christians, it is not salim, shalom. It is not peace. It is hudna, hudna in Arabic. Hudna is based on Muhammad's flight from Mecca to Medina. You say you believe in peace when you are in a weak position. But once you get the numbers, the strength, and the wherewithal, then you continue the jihad. A hudna is a ceasefire pretending to be peace. It is something that fits the Islamic doctrine of taqlid, permissible lying. They don't see it as a lie. They see it as military disinformation in the jihad. Now, are there non-fundamentalist Muslims who don't subscribe to this? Yes. Are there cultural Muslims? Yes. But remember, fewer than 15% of Germans and Austrians were Nazis. Fewer than 15%. Look what they did to Europe. Look what they did to Britain. Look what they did to Russia. Look what they did to the Jews. Look what they did to the Gypsies. And ultimately, look what they did to the German people. Less than 15%. In the Muslim world, in the 52 Muslim countries, the fundamentalists constitute a demographic percentage that may be in some countries as high as 50% or more. If it only takes less than 15% to have a blitzkrieg and a blitz and a Holocaust, what percentage of Muslims do you need to have a jihad? To have a religion of terror and hatred and oppression? There can be no peace until Jesus reigns from the throne of David. He is our peace, we shall be one. He is our reconciliation. As it says in Ephesians, the wall of partition is broken down. He is our peace, we shall be one. And that is sung in Hebrew by Jewish believers in Israel. Hu shlomenu nitached hu charitzui shelanu et mechitzat hayarva charas. Hu shlomenu nitached. He's our peace, we shall be one. You're not going to have any unity between Jew and Arab until it's Isaiah 19, until it's Zechariah 14, until Jesus is reigning. No Christ, no peace. There's a ridiculous organization calling itself Bridges for Peace, who claim to be philo-Semitic Christians, but they don't evangelize. No. Don't tell me you love the Jews if you're letting them continue into eternal judgment in hell without their own Messiah who died for their sin and rose to give eternal life to them and to all of us. They have a very peculiar definition of love. You have these Christians. The New Testament says clearly, We are ambassadors of Christ, those who preach him. But there's a bogus organization called the International Christian Embassy who have a non-evangelistic policy. They just want to support Israel politically and so forth without the gospel. Now, I am a supporter of Israel. I believe in the Jews' right to that land. And I believe that their regathering to that land fulfills prophecy. Jesus made that very clear. Jerusalem would be trampled down by the feet of the Gentiles till the time of the Gentiles is completed, Luke 21:24. They must be there for him to return, Matthew 23:39. They must be there to look upon him who was crucified. Zechariah chapter 12, 1-10. Christ actually speaks in the first person by the Holy Spirit in the Old Testament and in the New. Jesus made clear and unambiguous statements saying that the restoration of Israel has to happen and the return of the Jews to Jerusalem will be focal before the parousia and at the parousia. His return. I believe that, I know that. But I also know terrible calamities are coming upon the planet, upon Israel. 2/3 of them will be wiped out in their own land. And I speak as one who has Jewish children and grandchildren, born in Galilee. It gives me no joy or pleasure to say these things. But no Christ, no peace. You can have all the Abraham Accords you want. Now, some Christians are in tune with this, and they've gone to another extreme. They are saying, we have to look out. Donald Trump may be the Antichrist, or his Jewish son-in-law, Jared Kushner, may be the Antichrist. It is true. The Antichrist will bring a false peace to the Middle East. And there have been a number of treaties that have not brought peace. They brought a partial peace at best or have failed. Camp David brought a partial peace. But at Camp David, Menachem Begin wanted to give Gaza back to the Egyptians. The Egyptians wouldn't take it. They didn't want the Gazans. They didn't want it. Remember, up to 1948, Gaza was controlled by the British. From 1948 till 1967, it was ruled by Egypt. The Israelis conquered it in self-defense in 1967, and unilaterally, without a peace treaty, gave it up in the hope that if they had their own state, they would respond with peace. Instead, 5 times they launched attacks on Israel. Not one Katyusha missile, thousands of them, till finally there was a land invasion of October 7th, 2 years ago. The Israelis went to Gaza, conquered it in self-defense from the Egyptians, built an infrastructure, made it agriculturally viable with all these greenhouses, which they left there for the Gazans to use. Under the American government, an airport was built. Yet Fatah, the party that controlled the Palestinian Authority, formerly the Palestinian Liberation Organization of Yasser Arafat, embezzled billions of international aid given to create a Palestinian Muslim Arab state, call it what you will, in addition to the one that both Yasser Arafat and King Hussein of Jordan said already existed in Egypt, in Jordan. Yes, Arafat and King Hussein of Jordan both said Jordan is Palestine. 1970, circa. They could have had a state, but they didn't. Instead, they had a civil war. The people turned to Hamas because Arafat's people robbed them. And then, what do you have next? Hamas robs them, goes in league with Shia Iran, showing you that although Shias and Sunnis hate each other, they'll collaborate together against Israel. Because if they don't, they'll kill each other. The biggest human catastrophe in terms of warfare since the Second World War was in the 1980s, a war between Iran and Saddam Hussein's Iraq. 1.5 million Muslims killed by other Muslims in a war that was essentially a conflict between the Sunni and Shia Muslims that goes back to the 8th century to the Battle of Karbala. And they're still fighting it. They need this common enemy or they'll kill each other. And so there was a bloodbath in Gaza. There has never been a Palestinian state, so-called, in Gaza. Palestinians were anybody who lived in that land, irrespective of their religion or ethnicity. As I've pointed out many times, the original name of the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra was the Palestine Philharmonic Orchestra, all Jewish. The original name of the Jerusalem Post newspaper was the Palestine Post. The original name, the name of the British Palestinian Legion, should have been called the British Jewish Legion, because all 30,000 soldiers in it who fought for Britain and the Queen, the King, all 30,000 were Jews. The Mufti's men, the Palestinian Muslims, sided with Hitler. Jews fought with the British under Montgomery, as did North African Jews fight with the French against Rommel. There was a French Jewish Legion and a British Jewish Legion, but it was called the Palestine Legion. This invented name, Palestinian, was just invented. They were just Arabs like any other Arab. So there were no such thing as a Palestinian people. They were just the Arabs who lived in the area between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, or in the Transjordan, or east bank of the Jordan. A Hashemite Bedouin government created by the British. Remember, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria. These countries were all created by the British and French. It's all made up. It's all contrived. The idea of a Palestinian identity was contrived by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It's all contrived by Europeans, not by the indigenous Arab people themselves. No, the so-called Palestinian Arabs never ruled Gaza. It was British, it was Egyptian, it was Israeli. And under the Israelis, the squalor and horrific poverty that was in Gaza under the Egyptians disappeared. According to the World Health Organization of the United Nations, the standard of living increased in terms of everything from employment, longevity, infant mortality. It increased by 370% under the Israelis. The Arab Muslims of Gaza were 370% better off than they were under their fellow Egyptian Arab Muslims. The West Bank, similarly, the standard of living increased, according to the United Nations World Health Organization, by 320%. Yet they yell occupation and oppression and apartheid. Oh, my Lord. An Arab Superior Court judge in Israel, an Arab judge in Israel, sentenced an Israeli former president and an Israeli former prime minister to prison. That sound like apartheid to you? A country where 20% of the physicians, practicing physicians, are Arab? Does that sound like apartheid to you? I know people from South Africa who know what apartheid really was. Yet we're told the lie by Nelson Mandela's son that Israel is apartheid. Look what the ANC has done to South Africa. It's replaced one evil with another. The standard of living of blacks in South Africa has gone through the basement since the ANC came to power. South Africa replaced one evil with another, but to divert attention away from their own failure and what they've done to the blacks and whites who leave in droves, they have to go perpetuate this myth of apartheid. And I was against the apartheid in South Africa. I was totally opposed to it. But it replaced one evil with another. The black people in South Africa, infant mortality, longevity, unemployment has more than doubled since the end of apartheid among blacks. They're far worse off, but they have to divert away from their own mess. Let's blame Israel. Gaza, the people of Gaza were ripped off and exploited by Fatah, by Arafat's people, and then by Hamas. But they have to divert attention away from what they've done to their own people. Blame Israel. Enter Mr. Trump. He comes to these opportunist states, and I believe he is mistaken in his publicly expressed disposition towards Qatar. The government of Qatar is controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood, who killed Anwar Sadat for making peace with Israel, who control Hamas. Hamas is simply the Palestinian so-called military arm of the Muslim Brotherhood. Senior figures in the Muslim Brotherhood involved with the Council of American Islamic Relations in the United States, a dangerous organization that needs to be closed down, investigated by Congress. The Justice Department said they had these connections after September 11th. This is the Muslim Brotherhood. They control Hamas. They're involved with the Council of American Islamic Relations, to whom George Bush genuflected and paid homage, along with Cheney. And then the government of Qatar. There will be no lasting peace. They may put short-term business interests before the current political interests. However, no Christ, no peace. When you have a government in Qatar controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood, you can be sure it is not peace, it is not Salim, it is Hudna, a temporary ceasefire until we get the opportunity to strike, as Muhammad is said to have taught. Look at Zechariah 12. We are told this is going to happen. There can't possibly be a peace unless the word of God is false. The burden of the Lord concerning Jerusalem. I'm going to make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling to all the people around. There'll be a siege against Jerusalem. And we are told that the Lord himself will set about to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem, these surrounding nations. Read Psalm 83. Read Zechariah 12. No Christ, no peace. Now, I don't say that Mr. Trump or Mr. Kushner, who together with a few senior diplomats played a key role in brokering the present agreement. But it involved Erdogan, the Islamist dictator of Turkey. He's a partner in it. That man is wicked. He's trying to resurrect the Ottoman Empire, as well as destroying the economy of Turkey. No, it is very naive to put any faith in the Abraham or the Abrahamic Accords. Right now, it's based in Abu Dhabi. It's coming to Jerusalem. There'll be a false peace. We see these trends to rebuild the temple gaining momentum. I've been on the Temple Mount with Yehuda Glick, Orthodox Jews up on the Temple Mount. Orthodox Jews in Hebron walking around the cave of Machpelah, where there's a building, one portion of it a mosque, one portion of it a synagogue, built on this site of the, or traditional site of the tombs of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is happening. We are heading for this false peace. I have no doubt they're already burning red heifers and practice sacrifices. Not just the Temple Institute, who have nearly all of the artifacts needed to resurrect temple worship and to reconstruct the temple. Even crushing crustaceans found on the Mediterranean coast near Caesarea to make the exact dyes needed to dye color the curtains prescribed in the Torah for the temple. The detail is incredible. Mitochondrial DNA experiments to isolate the tribe of Levi, the Jews named like Cohen and Levinsky and Levi. They're very serious. A false peace will come to the Middle East. Mr. Trump's motives, I do not doubt. But I know what the Word of God tells me. Beware of a false peace in the Middle East. Daniel 9. He will break that 7-year covenant at some point. He'll make a 7-year covenant during the 70th week of Daniel, the final 7 lunar years of human history. But this has propelled a number of Christians on the internet and even speaking in some rallies and meetings in churches, speculating about Donald Trump or Jared Kushner being the Antichrist. Jared Kushner is Jewish. If another comes in his own name, him you will believe. The Antichrist will have to in some way have a Jewish identity, or Jews won't follow him. We deal with this in my book, Shadows of the Beast. I explain the anthropology and ancestry of the Antichrist to some degree. He has to be able to persuade the West, the Jews, and the Arabs. He's one of them. I digress. It's in the book. Not that I'm trying to plug the book, but it's too big of a subject to divert into. But let's look. He'll make this false peace. The stage is being set for it. And without doubt, the Abraham Accords, or Abrahamic Accords, as some are calling it, is a step in that direction. But is Donald Trump or Jared Kushner the Antichrist? Well, Jared Kushner, as a property developer, owns a building that's always been there. It was there when I was a little boy. It had a restaurant on top of it on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. The restaurant was called Top of the Sixes, Top of the Sixes, because the address of the building is 666 Fifth Avenue. acquired by Jared Kushner, who is married to Donald Trump's daughter, who converted to Judaism. So he is somewhat of an observant Jew. Non-observant Jews have no problem marrying what they would see as a Gentile woman, what their observant relatives would say is a shiksa. They wouldn't care. You see this in Hollywood all the time. Judaism is to do with ancestry, maybe a bit with culture, but that's about it, not faith. Mr. Trump, however, has Jewish grandchildren. And Jared Kushner played a pivotal role in brokering this ceasefire and in designing the Abraham Accords. Look with me, please, to the book of Daniel, chapter 11, with these things in view. Now, as some of you know, up until verse 36 of Daniel, there was a historical fulfillment of these prophecies of Daniel 11 in the epic saga of the Maccabees. That is the story of Hanukkah. Remembering that Jesus observed Hanukkah in John chapter 10, translated as the Feast of Dedication in English. It is the Hebrew Feast of Miracles and Lights, with rededicating the temple. Another Hanukkah is coming. There will be a rededication of the tribulational temple, in which the Shikutz HaMeshomem, the abomination of desolation, will be set up. But there's more to the abomination of desolation than just the statue or the robot that's going to occupy a position, space in the Holy of Holies. It has a much deeper meaning than that. Again, I point you to the book, Shadows of the Beast. Nonetheless, let's look. Daniel 11, up to verse 36, Antiochus did it. Antiochus IV, from the Seleucid Greek dynasty, a European dynasty who controlled the Middle East, following the death of Alexander the Great, when his empire was fragmented to four of his generals. The two most important biblically being Ptolemy, who controlled Egypt and southern Israel, and then Antiochus IV, known as Antiochus Epiphanes. The Jews at the time mocked him, calling him Antiochus Epimanes, the mad one. He, of course, set up the image of himself in the temple of the Greek god Zeus, who the Romans identified with the planet Jupiter, and he set this up, but he gave Zeus his own facial features and slaughtered a pig in the temple. There was much Jewish collaboration with him, led by someone called Menelaus, who was assassinated by the Maccabees in their revolt. These things predicted by Daniel took place, and Jesus commemorated it in John 10. At Hanukkah, the Jewish feast of lights and miracles. On the Tzevivon, on the top, the dreidel, it's called in Yiddish, Nes Gadol Haya Po, a great miracle happened here. The actual story of the menorah burning for 8 days did not find itself into the books of First and Second Maccabees. It was a later epilogue. It was a addendum to the books of First and Second Maccabees in the intertestamental literature. But notice something: the intertestamental period. It was during this period when the Maccabees were active, up to Daniel 36, chapter 11, 36. The Hasmonean period took place. John Hyrcanus took place, destroying the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim. Then a kind of resurrection an attempted resurrection of the kingdom of David when the Hebrews got control of the east bank of the Dead Sea and of the Jordan in part, areas of Edom. Those Arabs, descendants of Esau, were converted to Judaism and were transported by mass migration into the upper Negev, an area called Idumea. Herod the Great, a major type of the Antichrist, was an Idumean. He was a Jew of Arab ancestry. Again, I'd point you to the book, Shadows of the Beast. This intertestamental period, when the Hasmonean period happened, when John Hyrcanus happened, was when First and Second Enoch were written, not canonical, but of historical and literary importance, and they help us understand the book of Revelation greatly when read in Greek. And when First and Second Maccabees were written, the story of Hanukkah and the Maccabees. And Antiochus, a major, major picture of the Antichrist to come. It was also during this intertestamental period when something else took place. The translation in Alexandria of the Septuagint. The Hebrew scriptures were put into the lingua franca Greek. Ptolemy was a Greek who ruled Egypt. Cleopatra and these people were Greeks. They were not Arabs or Egyptians or anything like that. Some of them were Romans, like Mark Antony at a later point, but some of them were Greeks. Ptolemy was Greek, and the Hebrew scriptures were put into the lingua franca. So the story of Maccabees and the Septuagint, the translation of the Hebrew scriptures, and that's a whole other lengthy historical dialogue in its monologue in itself, came into being in translation. Now at verse 36, it changes. The Antichrist will come in the character of Antiochus, recapitulate what he did, but then go further. We'll pick up in verse 37. He, this is the king of the north. There will be a conflict between the north and the south. This has been evident for some time geopolitically. Even before the Iron Curtain came down, before Sovietism collapsed, you had Ostpolitik, a rapprochement between East and West Germany, and you had détente with Kissinger, with the Soviets. What had been an East-West conflict between the capitalistic West and the communist East began to shift north-south. The big wars became between the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere, or the northern countries of Europe and the southern countries of the Middle East. Let's look. The Falklands between Britain and Argentina was the first North-South war, geographically. The first Gulf War, the second Gulf War, the West against the South, the Islamic world. The conflict now, through immigration, mass immigration, encouraged by left-wing governments in Europe and by the European Union, a demographic invasion of Europe and Britain from the South, mainly Muslims, in part facilitated by Turkey. Big problem. Europeans and British people who were opposing it and putting these immigrants in hotels and these Muslim rape gangs and so forth. Britain has 85 Sharia courts. 85. And when the indigenous people, the indigenous Europeans, oppose it, they're called ultra-right extremists, neo-Nazis. Well, the real Nazis are the Islamo-Nazis, the invader. The Muslim Brotherhood and its adjuncts all say the same thing. We have three ways to make war to conquer Europe and America: a higher birth rate, two, immigration, including illegal immigration, and three, we are going to use your freedom and democracy against you. We don't have freedom and democracy in the Muslim world. You do, and that's your weakness, and we're going to take advantage of your laws. Like Olmert and Tlaib in the American Congress, and Ellis. They openly say this. Not only that, in Britain, it's worse. When they see a female Archbishop of Canterbury who was pro-LGBTQ, or an Anglican Archbishop in Wales who's in a lesbian marriage, to the Muslims of Britain, that proves prima facie that Christianity is spiritually bankrupt. This is the National Church of England. That Islam is morally and spiritually and theologically superior to Christianity. We have a mandate from our Allah to morally save Britain from itself because of the failure of Christianity. Yes, the World Council of Churches, the Vatican, the Church of England, certainly, are all complicit in fueling this radicalism in Islam, who thinks itself morally superior, when this Pope and his predecessor places benediction on same-sex relationships. To them, it's proof. Having turned away from their Judeo-Christian heritage, from their biblical foundations as societies and nations, democracy is disappearing in the West, and Islam is becoming more aggressive. This is just like a page out of the book of Judges. When the ancient Israelites turned away from the Torah and the God of the Torah, the Amalekites and the Philistines were in the ascent. Well, that is what is happening now in the Western world. Exactly what's happening. Committing suicide. This can only go so far for so long, and there will be a conflict between the North and the South. These left-wing governments have pushed too far. There is a reaction. Geert Wilders, there's a reaction in Germany, but they condemned the German patriots as being almost neo-Nazis, when in fact is the forces of radical Islam whom the mayor's government and his coalition partners are pandering to. France, it's the same. Stop Le Pen. Now, her father was an anti-Semite. She claims not to be. But they've got to stop her from becoming president of France, because she'll stand up to Islamic aggression. Starmer, the same in Britain. Arrest people who criticize Islam as spreading hate crime and inciting hatred and violence, when they're only telling the truth. Well, you see the Reform Party in Britain. And that involves moderate Muslims who don't agree with Sharia being imposed. With Geert Wilders in Holland, with Le Pen in Paris, Germany, you see this. And you certainly see it in the countries of Eastern Europe. Remember, it was Eastern Europe under King Jan Sobieski who in Vienna saved Europe from being Islamized. The Polish, the Lithuanians, Ukrainians, they stopped the Turkish Muslim invasion of Europe under King Jan Sobieski. Those people are resisting Islam. You can call these people Nazis. You can have the BBC and the mainstream media denouncing these people. And you can have the mainstream media and left wing academics singing the praises of Hamas. It doesn't matter. There is going to be a conflict between the kings of the North and the kings of the South. It is inevitable. This is what you see with Nigel Farage in England. It's what you see with Ms. Le Pen in France. What you see with Geert Wilders in Holland. It's what you see with Donald Trump and Mr. Vance, etc., in the United States. There'll be this conflict. The kings of the North and the kings of the South. Ultimately, the Antichrist will somehow get control of the North, of fragmenting Europe where the iron doesn't stick to the clay. He will come in the character of Antiochus up to a point. Antiochus was again a European. He'll do as he pleases, but in verse 37, he will show no regard for the gods, plural, of his fathers, Elohim, or the desire of women. This is in the Hebrew portion, not the Aramaic portion of Daniel. Nor will he show regard for any other god, but he will magnify himself above them all. Instead, he will honor a god, but instead a god of fortresses, a god whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures, and take action. He will defeat the kings of the south in verse 40. That time the king of the south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots, horsemen, with many ships, and he will enter countries, overflow them, and pass through, and he'll enter the beautiful land. Now, there's a deep meaning to that, but it speaks also of literal geographical Israel. And many countries will fall. Somehow, areas of Jordan will survive the Antichrist domain, at least up to a point. Edom, Moab, and the foremost of the sons of Ammon. Ammon, Jordan, is named after Ammon. This is northern Jordan. Moab is central Jordan, and Edom, where Esau went, has to do with red. Edom is southern Jordan. Many people believe, with some good reason, that that is why there will be an escape flight of Jews to Petra, to Basra, to Petra. It's there. That's where Petra is. Just as the early Christians escaped to Ammon, to a place called Pila, after 70 AD, under Simeon, the cousin of Jesus, who escaped the siege of Titus in 70 AD. Place of escape has always been Jordan, for Christians and for Jews, and will be again prophetically. But I digress. So, because of this false peace, people are beginning to say, Mr. Trump might be the Antichrist, or Mr. Jared, who's a Jew, might be the Antichrist. Here is the most obvious problem. Neither Mr. Trump nor Mr. Kushner have come in the character of Antiochus and done what Antiochus did up until verse 36. The Antichrist will come in the character, the man of lawlessness, the man of sin, the little horn. They're all titles for the same and descriptions of the same person. The kings of the north will come in the character of Antiochus and recapitulate in some way what Antiochus did. That is not true of Donald Trump, and it's not true of Mr. Kushner. But then it becomes a bit more complicated linguistically. I have read this and reread it in Greek from the Septuagint, and I have read it and reread it in Hebrew. I will come to that in a second. Before looking at the linguistic, I'd also point out that some people associate Jared Kushner with transhumanism. He has made statements that seem to incorporate transhuman belief. Now, transhumanism goes back to the garden. You can be like God. Man can deify himself and become his own God. However, there are other episodes of this. The Tower of Babel. Now nothing shall be impossible for them. The deification of man, God intervenes. To the present time. The eugenics movement. Friedrich Nietzsche, who said God is dead, the 19th century German rationalist philosopher, believed and propounded the idea of the Übermensch, the Superman. As man evolved from a genetically inferior species that was something of a ancestor to both the other apes and humans. Phylum Chordata, primates, man and ape had a common evolutionary ancestor. That was the theory. And as man evolved from this other species into the Homo sapien, through the Neanderthal stages and so forth, the Übermensch, the Superman, would evolve from this. The philosopher Nietzsche, and I used to read him when I was in my early 20s, late teens, maybe early 20s, certainly. He wrote a book, Also Sprach Zarathustra. My German was not good enough to read it. I can only get by chatting in German, but I can't really read German I read it very badly. I can read it, but not that well. Well, I can read theological German a bit, but the philosophical German is a bit above my pay grade. So I read translations of it, or perhaps the German next to the English. Also sprach Zarathustra. And he modeled Zarathustra, teaching in parables after Jesus. Not as a divine figure, but as a Superman who pointed the way forward, where a second birth would be replaced by this evolutionary process of evolving to a higher species. The philosophical basis for this primarily came from Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century German rationalist, who was not an anti-Semite, ironically. Although Hitler drew on Nietzsche, he didn't really follow all of Nietzsche's ideas. Nietzsche was not an anti-Semite. And Nietzsche was at odds with the composer Wagner, Richard Wagner, who was an anti-Semite. Nietzsche didn't like him and had problems with some of his music for philosophical reasons. Anyway, the philosophical basis of this transhumanism came from Nietzsche. God is dead. The theological basis of it goes back to the garden and then is resurrected in the epic of the Tower of Babel. Then it goes forward. Hitler comes and tries to breed the Übermensch, uniting German nationalism, anthropologically based German nationalism, with the idea of eugenics. We can genetically breed a master race. Who would be the Germans? One of the many reasons Hitler hated the Jews. Jews had the best scientists, Germans had the best engineers. He saw Jews as a potential competitor, as a master race. As the Italians predominated in the Renaissance, and as the Greeks did in the ancient world, and so forth, and as the British did in the Age of Empire, in the 20th century, following the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, when the Jews began escaping rabbinic control of their culture and education and began secularizing, Jews began to emerge in multiple fields in disproportionately large numbers. Now, this has happened to the Dutch, it's happened to the British, it's happened to the Italians, certainly, to the Greeks. The Jews are just having their turn at this time in history. But Hitler wanted the Germans to be the master race. He looked down on Slavs because they were also white, but a potential competitor. So he hated the Russians because he was a white supremacist, but he wanted German white supremacy. He didn't want Slavic white supremacy. The term slave came from Slavic, the Slavic people, and he saw them as that way. He hated the Jews for a reason, he hated the Slavs for a reason. He had this very peculiar idea of anthropology. When Mussolini visited Hitler, they had all of the honor guards from northern Italy where they had light complexion and looked Germanic. They didn't want people from Sicily or southern Italy because they had dark complexions. Mussolini knew Hitler would look down on this. He wanted light-skinned Italians with blonde hair, blue eyes, and so forth, who looked Germanic. Hitler would have preferred to have a treaty with the British because they were Anglo-Saxon. They were Germanic people. He was the only opponent that he had all respected because they were anthropologically a Germanic people. Of course, they were Celt, mixed, and Nordic. With William the Conqueror, they were a mixture of Nordic, Celtic, and Germanic. But that was Hitler's thinking. So Hitler begins to push this, the master race. And he'd begin to breed. He'd have these Aryan women and things like this. And he'd begin doing breeding experiments, medically supervised breeding experiments to try to make a master race and kill the other races. He hated the gypsies. Same thing. They were genetically inferior. Hitler became enraged when Black Americans like Jesse Owen won all these Olympic gold medals and outperformed German athletes. When the Olympics were held in Berlin, Hitler was enraged that Black Americans could outperform the German master race. Hitler walked out angry. When Joe Louis knocked out Max Schmeling, Hitler was enraged that a Black American could defeat a German in a boxing match. It went against his white supremacist ideology. He was a real white supremacist, not the kind of garbage the woke people say now. He was really a racist. But he was a eugenicist, a transhumanist. With the early breakthroughs leading up to and immediately following Watson and Crick and Wilkins with the recombinant DNA, something else began to happen. The British biologist Julian Huxley in 1957 coined the phrase transhumanism. This became politicized in the year 2002 by Jay Hughes in a monogram he wrote, essentially, where he identified transhumanism with the political left. These people began to see the prospects of biogenetic engineering. But that was again revolutionized by implantable microchips. Enter the Israeli homosexual professor of medieval history and advisor to the Schwab Slobs, the World Economic Forum, Yuval Hariri. He basically says Silicon Valley is the New Jerusalem, the new Vatican, the new Mecca, the cradle of the new religion. Transhumanism. Darwinism begins to collapse. Not primarily because of creation science, although creation science has challenged it for the lie it is, but because in the arrogance of fallen man, going back to the garden, you can be like God, people have begun to think they can control evolution. We are no longer at the mercy of any Darwinistic model or an evolutionary tide of events we can't control. We can control it with our technology, with biogenetic engineering, and with microelectronics, and with artificial intelligence. Transhumanism. Some of these ideas have been expounded, particularly for indefinite longevity, by Jared Kushner. Now, notice the goal of transhumanism. We can give ourselves eternal life. They don't realize that the superiority of human intelligence is because we're made in God's image and likeness. We think we can overtake God. Right back to the garden, a bite of the apple. The serpent beguiled the woman, and Adam fell for it. Right back to the Tower of Babel, nothing will be impossible for them. Transhumanism. Seeing that Jared Kushner has become something of a devotee of this kind of thinking, has reinforced the speculation that he is an Antichrist or the Antichrist. He owns 666 Fifth Avenue, one of the preeminent skyscrapers in New York. He's a Jew. And he seems to be transhumanistic, even though he does not identify as a transhumanist, or at least never has. People say this, and there are Christians getting into this, as well as secular conspiracy theorists and other people who they're gleaning things from. Does Mr. Trump or Mr. Kushner fit the profile? First problem. There are many antichrists, and it's a spirit that's in the world. But the Antichrist? No, neither Donald Trump nor Jared Kushner have in any way recapitulated the actions of Antiochus Epiphanes up to verse 36. But then we get to verse 37. I'm reading from the New American Standard, but again, I've been reading this in the Septuagint in Greek and in the Hebrew. Reading Daniel 11 from verse 37, let's read it very carefully. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers, or for the desire of women, nor will he show regard for any other god, but he will magnify himself above them all. This is not the easiest verse or passage to translate. And experts, and although I'm literate in the language, I suppose you'd call me a quasi-expert, but I'm not an expert. Experts have been divided. I will tell you how I arrived at my own position. the term here for he'll have no desire for women is hemdat nashim. Hemdat nashim. Now, problematically, this can be understood as I just read it in the New American Standard, which says that he'll show no regard for the gods of his fathers or the desire for women. Okay. But it could also be read on one coveted of women, very literally, or God longed for by women, the God longed for by women, or to the one beloved by women. Which is it? Does it mean he'll have no regard for the gods of his fathers and no regard or desire for women? Or does it mean something different? Does it mean literally, very literally, on one coveted of women? Often translated, God longed for by women, or to the one beloved by women. Some translators think this simply means that he puts himself above all other gods. That includes female cult deities. Others think that the women who desire the true God, and they highlighted the women of Jerusalem weeping over Jesus, or things of this nature, or the female personification of Israel as the wife of Jehovah, or the church as the bride of Christ. They have tried to look at it that way. I'm not dismissing the possibility that those meanings could be included in the text. I don't necessarily believe there's only one meaning, one meaning. I believe there's one primary meaning, but there are multiple other associated ramifications of that meaning. Some have said it's female cult deities as well as ordinary idols. Others, other translators particularly, have no regard for the God longed for by women. My own approach tends to agree with certain translations, including the New American Standard, not because the New American Standard said it. I always revert to the Septuagint for the following reasons. One, when the Holy Spirit inspired the New Testament to be written primarily in Greek, although there is a tradition that Matthew may have been written, if not in Hebrew, the Hebrew dialect of Aramaic, by one tradition. I think it has Papias in the pre-Nicene church, the church father, in the patristic age. And there are certain Aramaic terms, and even Latin terms in the New Testament, in the original Greek manuscripts. In the majority texts, more than 80% of the time, maybe 85% of the time, when the Holy Spirit inspired the apostles and the New Testament authors to write the New Testament, when they quoted the Old, they followed the Septuagint. They followed the Septuagint. The New Testament normally follows the Septuagint. Now, there's all kinds of debates surrounding the Septuagint, including some postulated by King James only nuts and people like this. Not that I have any problem with the King James. But let's understand this. The Septuagint is normally followed by the New Testament when the Holy Spirit inspired the apostles to read it, to quote from it. When they wrote the New Testament, they normally follow the Septuagint. Secondly, the story of the Maccabees and Antiochus took place during the intertestamental period when the Septuagint was written. That is the second thing. It's from the same period reflected in the linguistic structure and composition, grammatically and in terms of vocabulary and etymology. Thirdly, in addition to those two things, the Septuagint tells us how the ancient Jews of that time understood it. Even after the Maccabees, they held to this Septuagint translation when the prophecies were fulfilled of Daniel in the time of the Maccabees. Daniel, of course, wrote during the end of the Babylonian captivity, during that period, while during the captivity, during the 70-year period, the Maccabees were about 160 years before Christ. It tells us how the Jews of that time, the sages, understood it. In the Septuagint, kai epetos theos, ton perenon oto, okai epitumia, gynekos, kai epipanti theos o, sinisi hoti epipanti, megala thesitai. The Septuagint tells us that he shall not take notice even of other gods. But it also says that he'll magnify himself. He doesn't even consider the others. Concerning the women, however, gynekos, epithumia gynekos, the Septuagint translates it as he'll have no regard or desire, or no desire for women. I think the Septuagint, which again is what the New Testament authors were inspired to quote based on the majority text, when having formula citations, quotations from the Old Testament and so forth, states that it's for women. He'll have no regard for the gods. This does not necessarily imply idolatry, but the plurality of the Godhead. The Antichrist will counterfeit Christ. We know from John 5, and it is insinuated from Revelation, the beast from the earth, that he's going to be in some way a Jew. Maybe in the sense that Herod was a Jew. I'd point you to my book, Shadows of the Beast. Having said that, Jesus was single. He was born to die for sin and to raise from the dead to abolish death. Nonetheless, he couldn't have a wife and kids. Jesus had close associations with women. Mary Magdalene, obviously, and others. Mary and Martha. But there was nothing of a romantic or marital or sexual nature. Some have said that the Antichrist will be a homosexual. They may have a point, but what is clear is He's going to counterfeit Christ. Jesus was celibate and had the grace to be celibate because of the calling the Father gave him. I'm persuaded the likely meaning is what we see in such translations as the New American, but not only the New American, there are others. That he will not have regard for the God of his fathers, being the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he will not have regard or desire for women. Okay. I'm not saying there is no merit in those who say that it is a almost hyperbolic emphasis on the fact that he will not take note of other gods and he will only deify himself. I'm not dismissing the fact that it could be translated differently than the Septuagint from the Hebrew, the God longed for by women, or to the one beloved by women, or the one coveted of women. I'm not saying you cannot make those arguments in terms of translation. I am saying that for the aforementioned reasons, I believe the Septuagint is most likely to be right. Again, when the Holy Spirit inspired the apostles and New Testament authors to write the New Testament and they quoted from the Old, they normally, almost always followed the Septuagint. It shows how the learned Jews of the time understood it, the sages, and it shows something of the lingual milieu of the time in the intertestamental period. So I go with the Septuagint. That is why I am inclined to believe the New American Standard is, and other translations are right when they say he'll have no regard for women. There may be the homosexual element. However, there is something else that commentators don't seem to talk about that does bear mention. Look with me, please, to the book of Revelation. Chapter 17. Verse 15. Could the women, be a reference to the whore of Babylon, the mother of harlots? And he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues, paralleling those who are raptured and rescued from the great tribulation in chapter 7 of Revelation. And the 10 horns which you saw, and the beast, these will hate the harlot and make her desolate and naked, and will eat her flesh and will burn her up with fire. The Antichrist and his cohorts will use the harlot religious system. They will use the amalgamation of false religion, including the harlot church, which is something that includes but is not limited to Roman Catholicism, liberal Protestantism, the World Council of Churches, the Eastern Orthodox, the whole thing. All non-biblical expressions or corruptions or counterfeits of Christianity. Babylon, the great whore. There is a league between the economic, the political, and religious systems of the world. The Antichrist and his collaborators will use the whore to get power. Once they get the power, they will get rid of the whore. He wants to be the only God. This is another aspect that is a possibility that has to be taken into account, not to the negation of the fact that he's going to be celibate or whatever. Celibate, but potentially homosexual, not to the negation of that. But the no regard or the disregard for women could point to what the Antichrist is going to do with the beast. It's a bit surprising to me. I don't usually go to commentaries until I go to the Lord, if I go to commentaries at all. But this time, I do go to lexical commentaries, to linguistic commentaries. I don't usually go to commentaries per se until I go to the Lord, if I go to them at all. But I usually don't go to them at all. But I do go to lexical commentaries for the language. Again, I'm pretty competent in the languages, but there's other people who are equally as competent and more competent. And I like to look at all of the academic opinions linguistically. So, having done that and having said that, I do think it is surprising that more people have not taken into account how this seems to, or may at least, relate to Revelation chapter 17, the great harlot, the whore of Babylon. Also, there is one more thing we need to look at. It's found in 1 Timothy chapter 4, where it speaks of the apostasy of the last days. And one of the apostasies that will gain momentum in the last days is mandatory celibacy, the forbidding of marriage, something long practiced by the Roman Catholic Church for its corrupt pedophile clergy. Not that they're all pedophiles, but a number of them are, obviously. And a number are homosexuals, and a number of nuns lesbians. We know this from nuns and priests who've gotten saved and given their testimony and have told what really goes on. Be that as it may, forbidding marriage. The orchestra conductor of the apostasy will be the Antichrist. And there will be this forbidding of marriage. That also has to be noted. It has to be taken into account. Now, when we put these things together, none of it fits either Donald Trump or Jared Kushner. None of it. Jared Kushner practices a form of Judaism. Donald Trump's daughter, Ivanka, who married him, converted to Judaism. And they bring their children up in the Jewish faith. This is not somebody who has no regard for the God of his fathers. Secondly, he's married to Donald Trump's daughter. He has a regard for women. Donald Trump is on his fourth marriage. And he's been accused by feminists and so forth, and left-wing, politically left-wing feminists particularly, of being a womanizer. He doesn't fit that profile. He does have a regard for women or desire for women. Additionally, remember, transhumanism in its present form has been politicized. Going back to the time of Jay Hughes in 2002, that was the beginning. And it is a politically left-wing orientation of its proponents are almost stereotypically left-wing. Mr. Kushner is not left-wing. He's a right of center. He's a fairly conservative, politically conservative, and fiscally conservative figure. Again, do not fit the profile. I can see no evidence for Mr. Kushner to be the Antichrist. There are things that are suggestive of certain aspects of what the Antichrist may be or do, particularly concerning the Abrahamic Accords. But he does not fit the personality profile. Similarly, Donald Trump is a non-Jew. His Christian connections were through his great aunt, who were one of the people involved in the Hebrides in Scotland during the revival of Duncan Campbell in the late 1940s. He had maternal ancestors who were saved Christians. One of his two golf resorts in Scotland, Turnberry, is not that far south of the Hebrides, where his mother's family comes from. His mother could actually speak Scottish Gaelic. And that's where he got his Presbyterian identity, Presbyterian Protestantism. He had family who were believers. He does have a belief in God. I don't believe he's a saved Christian, but he does have a belief in God. And he may be courting born-again Christians or evangelicals, call them what you will, for political reasons, but we cannot say he does not take notice of God, which is what the Septuagint states and what the Hebrew almost states of Daniel 11. So putting all these things together, I cannot see a basis to propose that either Donald Trump or Jared Kushner are the Antichrist. I do think some of the policies they're pursuing and engineering and negotiating are preparing the way for Antichrist. But I don't think they are nefarious figures with malmotives. I don't think they're the man of lawlessness, the little horn, the son of perdition. There are reasons to believe they are, too many reasons to believe they can't be. And not enough reasons to say they can be. That is my position to the best of my prayerful and careful understanding. Be wary of these things. Watch out. Watch for the way this thing is going with the Abraham Accords. By all means, be vigilant and watch out. But I would not lend any serious credence to speculations of either Donald Trump or his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, being the king of the North. That is the final problem. This conflict involving the king of the North will be Eurocentric. Eurocentric. A conflict between the Middle East, the Southern Hemisphere, the Middle East, say North Africa, where these refugees are even coming from, such as Libya, to Europe. And they're overrunning Europe, all the way into Scandinavia and Britain and Ireland. It is a Eurocentric focus. The beast that came out of the sea would have been understood in the first century as the Mediterranean. It's Eurocentric, Eurofocal. Mr. Trump and Mr. Kushner are North American. They're not Middle Eastern. They're not European. That is the final reason I'm skeptical. Nonetheless, beware of anything that proposes to bring a peace to the Middle East. Do not become rambunctious when you see a covenant. Remember, you've had Camp David, Oslo I, Oslo II. There have been other covenants trying to bring peace to the Middle East. The one the Antichrist will bring will be different than the others. But the Abrahamic Accords are a step in that direction. Watch out. Be careful. Be observant. Be watchful. And please keep Mr. Trump and his administration in prayer. Thank you so much for listening. My name is James Jacob Prasch from Moriel Ministries. God bless.
Hello, and thank you for watching Moriel TV. There are so many things that are happening at Moriel Ministries worldwide, from the Philippines to Japan, to India to Africa, and back to Europe and the United States. So many of our brothers and sisters are spreading the good news of Jesus Christ to this lost world. We are so thankful for your prayers. God has been faithful and has blessed us in so many ways. If you'd like to partner with our efforts abroad and at home, please take a moment to click the link in the description and help us as the Lord leads you. Thank you very much, and God bless.